Good evening, parents, carers and community members. Welcome to our webinar this evening, where we're going to be focusing on masculine mentoring and healthy role models. Before I introduce our speaker this evening and what this webinar will be focused on, I just want to say please do bear with us if we do encounter any technical difficulties. We're not expecting any, so hopefully we'll run as smoothly as always. I also just wanted to signpost you to our next webinar, which is the 27th of January, a different focus, but we know these webinars are really varied, and it's going to be on AI and teaching and learning at Forest, and that's going to be led by the academic team. So some of you may recognise our speaker this evening. He's becoming part of the Forest family. So Jamie Coupe is a passionate mental health and wellbeing speaker, mentor and founder of the Primal Grace philosophy. He works one-to-one with clients and their families to understand the roots of mental health issues such as addiction, varying forms of anxiety with a background in psychology, counselling, charity work and mentoring. He also leads workshops and seminars on masculine mental health and suicide prevention across the country and working predominantly in sports and education. And as I said, he's a real, I would say, extended part of the family in Forest for our pastoral and safeguarding work. And we're really, really excited to have him back. So a little bit more about this webinar. So the topic for the webinar this evening is masculine mentoring and healthy role models. And Jamie will aim to cover a range of issues facing young men and young people at present. This includes findings from Gaber Mate, if I've pronounced it, he'll say it much better than me, on reduced time for family connection, and his own work on the dad vacuum, Andrew Tate, and the issues arising from poor role models in the media and online. Jamie will also be including some of his work he's been doing to help young people through these issues. And we'll know in our car journeys with young people, at our dinner table conversations, and either at Forest in school, in the corridors, in RSHE lessons, in tutor rooms. These are themes and topics that we want to really speak about at Forest. We don't want to hide away from them, even though at times it may be difficult, they may be sensitive, and we may not actually have all the answers as community members. But how we can best support the young people in our care is opening up these conversations and ensuring that we're allowing them the space and the time to speak about them. And what Jamie's going to do is give us maybe some top tips and some vocabulary and language for us to be able to have those conversations with the young people in school and at home. So I wish you a wonderful evening. And without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Jamie.
Good evening. Thank you so much. And I'm really glad you said the kind of extended family aspect, because that is what it feels like. And my name's Jamie, if this is the first time you've kind of seen me, but Natasha and Emily as well, a number of other staff. I remember my time at Forest School. I absolutely loved the kids, the talk, the experience, going to see what goes on there. But I was absolutely blown away by the conversations we had with the pastoral team and passing teachers, sports teachers, and how engaged everyone is at Forest. And it is becoming my favourite. There's a couple that kind of compete, but I did want to reiterate that if you're kind of new to the school, that yes, sometimes like today or like my previous talk, there might be some ruffled feathers or there's some new ideas that maybe don't have set solutions. I will be providing some solutions or aspects of that. But for me, Forest School is amazing because it does balance that cutting edge, let's see what we can do, but it's with a really informed, researched and kind of carefully curated approach. So really glad you said that. And that was the kind of first thing I wanted to say. I'm incredibly impressed with Forest and absolutely love coming back to do these. So how it will work, if this is your first seminar, if you're watching back, obviously you can't ask questions when you're watching back, but at any moment, I believe you might have a kind of little chat box, or you can send them to Natasha and they pop up here. So I won't necessarily be stopping to take any questions, possibly at the end, but what I want to do is respect your time and really try and give you as much as I can in this kind of structure that I put together tonight. So first of all, who am I? My name's Jamie. I'm coming up to 31 years old, and I've got a variation of things in my background. Tonight, we're talking about male role modeling. So I think the most poignant thing to start with is my own absence of a male role model, my own kind of absence of a father figure as I needed him. I myself would kind of identify, if we have these feminine and masculine cores within us all, I need my feminine core for my work. I was learning to grow my masculine core. That was interrupted when I was younger. So kind of where my issues are, my father has always had depressions, never worked a day in his life. He tends to avoid issues. He doesn't really come to the fore in terms of fighting for us as a family. So those are quite difficult things to grow up with. And and as I'll talk about today, there's this aspect of a kind of vacuum in my own life. And I've used the word dad. I'm fully aware. This is parents, carers. This is not about necessarily gender. It's just how I've chosen to talk about it today. So again, I hope that doesn't ruffle anything and avoid you from hearing the really, really crucial message that we have and shedding a bit of perspective. So my father is still alive, but he struggled with suicidality, that being low mood, alcoholism, absence, always sleeping all the time, never present, never looking after us. So it was quite a strange experience when I was younger, as I said, to not have that clear father figure for me, male role model, as I will say it tonight, masculine influence as I needed it. This is not for everyone, but I know this applies to a lot of young men I work with, a lot of young people I speak to. Thankfully, as you can see, it says Iron Mill College in that kind of blue box, and that's part of my journey, has been some counselling training as well. That was my mother's influence. So in terms of my feminine core, in terms of my feminine role modelling, and indeed, credit to my mum, a lot of the masculine role modelling she kind of stepped into in her best has come from her. So incredible place, the Iron Mill College, if you haven't heard of it, but it's counselling training at the highest level, integrative as well. So it kind of brings in as much as possible. Similar to my talk tonight, it'll be how do we pull as many useful things as possible. And even if you want to jump across to Primal Grace, my company, and that came from a philosophy whereby, as I say in my talks, Primal Grace I'll show you in a moment, but it comes from what actually works for young people. So it includes traditional things like talking therapy. It includes those kind of scientific aspects as well. What was really interesting for me when I was growing up was going, okay, I've been told I need counselling. I've been told I need to keep fit. I've been told I need to X, Y, and Z. Some of those things didn't feel quite right. I later found out that might be because I am a male, so to speak, or I have I prefer a masculine inclination towards therapy, because I find that just today, a lot of young women who maybe identify more with their masculine side also really benefit from the way that I do things. So as much as it might be men's mental health I put here, or masculine mental health, or male role modeling, I really am just saying those who are looking for a traditionally masculine, traditionally male aspect to their life. And again, they're very, very loaded terms. What is a man? That's what we'll talk about today. Masculine, feminine. So that's why I love Forest School. That's why I love doing my work, because it is about just going, hey, why do we use those words? Where is this useful? So Primal Grace I'll talk about in a moment, my degree. And then Exeter City Community Trust is attached to the football club. That's another part of my job. So today I was with, 12 young people, Key Stage 3. So I think they're about 12 or 13 years old, if I've not got that wrong. And what I'm focusing on is predominantly we're outside, we're playing sport, we're playing football, we're playing rugby, we're playing cricket. But the whole time I'm implementing the Primal Grace philosophy in terms of this kind of 10 questions structure to their mental well-being. Again, incorporating everything, because these are young people. So what we want to do is just give them something practical, something fun, something simple, something they can actually act on. And a lot of my work is around suicide prevention. A lot of my work is around preventing young people or anyone getting into those really horrible spots. So I love Exeter City because they allow me to go into a school, work with the behavioural teams, local council, psychologists, teachers, but bring these young people that are struggling. It might be behavioural, it might be any number of things. But then when I have time with them, and again, I'll talk about more specifically things like the third thing, which is a massive part of masculine mental health, working with young men, that being having a third thing in play while you're trying to talk to them, while you're trying to interact. That's where the sport is brilliant for Exeter City Trust. And day to day, I'm playing sport or we're doing something else. And lo and behold, as Natasha was saying, those car journeys or those kind of intercostal conversations, I heard someone say it like that. It's a really beautiful way of thinking about it. But I love the idea of sport. There are lots of other options if you don't have sport, but really, really blessed. Chuck a rugby ball around. Like today, the girls were like, please can we do the 10 questions? I was like, sure, we can. So we chuck a ball around and I ask them these 10 questions. But the beauty of that is it then opens further conversations as to what's the origin, what's the issue. And absolute worst case, they've had 10 opportunities to look at 10 ways they can change their well-being and feel better straight away. And also worth saying, the Samaritans is an incredible organization. I've trained, volunteered there previously myself. As I said, I think that's the best way to talk about it. And tonight we're not looking necessarily at suicide prevention. Otherwise, I would talk about that aspect of my journey going forward, which is again relevant. But when we're talking about young people, when we're looking at well-being, I'm much more preventative side. So I think kids around 12 years old. I'll do talks for years 10 through to kind of university age. They do get it. And this stuff is relevant and it can be scary. And again, as Natasha said beautifully, we shouldn't be afraid to talk about these things that scare young people, because they are happening. It does happen far too often. So that's normally something I talk a little bit more about, but tonight I want to move right into our subject. Again, this is just a kind of summary of what I've said of men's or masculine mental health, difference in help-seeking behavior, coping strategies, how young boys and young girls traditionally, as men and women traditionally, there's always exceptions, luckily, how they tend to feel, how they tend to seek help or not, what they will accept or won't accept. And for me, the masculine mental health is, let's say there's 10 things that help you therapeutically. There are way more. But, currently we're kind of skewed whereby the feminine half of those things, which I absolutely know are crucial to my own mental health, they tend to be presented first. So young men are not necessarily seeing that part of that buffet that makes sense to them. That's why I love what I do, and you kind of turn it so maybe a bit of sport gets them in, or maybe a little bit of kind of nature work will get them in, and then you can start talking to them, then you can look at all the other kind of aspects as well. So friends, community collaboration is brilliant. Not talking about that necessarily today, but so important, and loads of beautiful studies on that. So again, this is primal grace. This is strength through vulnerability. That's the only thing I'd pick out here, because again, we're not necessarily talking about the suicide prevention aspect, but strength through vulnerability is how do we show the young men that I work with, one being in the bottom left there, how it is to be healthy as a male, to be a positive presence in your community, your family, your sports teams, your job, your studies. How do you do that? And again, I'll talk more specifically as we go. Any questions, please still fire them through. But for me, I really saw it as a kind of, how do we get everyone together? How do we get everyone learning at the same time, as opposed to just kind of piecemeal, or how I experienced it to not be that effective. So that's the team. That was us traveling. And I know that's a kind of privileged aspect of this, and something I love to talk about when I'm dealing with people who do have money, when I'm dealing with people that went to private school. I also went to private school. Is a unique kind of pressure that causes a secondary type of depression, or the second type of depression. So it's really interesting stuff that comes with that aspect of privilege. And again, I love Forest because they'll more than welcome that aspect, and a lot of young people. One young woman in particular I really enjoyed speaking to after. So I'm going to rip through, because I want to make sure this is some of the network. So again, Forest School top left, that's perfect, didn't plan that, but these are some of the schools I have the pleasure to work with, in a sense of, if it's seminars, if it's conversations, even just a couple of emails and calls, I learn so much and then try and share. Sporting wise, started conversations and building a network. Liverpool Football Club, Fiji Rugby, Leicester Tigers, Sale Sharks, England Schoolboy Rugby, and more recently the Rugby Player Association, which is awesome. Emily Lord is absolutely fantastic. So learning there, and then some of the work in Fiji we might be doing, or Exeter Cathedral County Council. So what I'm doing, as I said earlier, which will form the philosophy and my kind of general approach, is what's already there. Cool, I understand that, but what is it that will work? Who is it I need to speak to? Can we get everyone starting to have these conversations? And sports education, they're huge for young people. That's where they are. And again, if we can get them, give them the skills really early, that to me is preventative and really helps. So this is a quick rundown of primal grace. So I split them into kind of two halves. So the primal side is more addressing the physicality, physiology, this idea we are animals, tradition, all those kind of things. But sleep, sunlight, nature, relationships, and movement, that kind of fills half. And there's 5 questions. How are you sleeping? You're getting enough sunlight? What's your time in nature? What are your relationships like? What's the quality? What's the variation? Interaction. So the girls would have answered these today. Movement, how are you moving? What kind of movement are you enjoying? And then the second half, the grace side, is more kind of spirituality, science, religion, if you will, too, I think is absolutely crucial. And that's processing in terms of talking to people about how you're feeling, what's going on. Mindfulness, a lot about that, but it doesn't need to be complicated. Showing them that diet is really crucial. Anger, crying, emotional processing, and then joy. So that's the kind of community-based healing as well. That's just the bottom there. So if you saw us all in relation with each other, as opposed to just me, you in a room, I remember that being quite intense when I was younger and kind of left me with difficult feelings. So this is my approach to how I feel that masculine role modeling works best. So again, that's kind of just glazing through, because I want to jump into our topic. So one of my favorite people, mainly because Gabor Mate is phenomenal. I kind of grew up around his books. I was too young to really be that interested. My mum's a counsellor, therapist, has been for a long time. She's always preached his work. But the beautiful thing is that Gabor Mate is world leader on trauma, on many, many things, but still suffers himself. And I think that to me is the crucial thing about male role modeling is vulnerability. I connect with young people, as I did today, and when I work with one-to-one clients, one of the first things I try and help them to understand is, yes, this is my job. Yes, this is my fascination, my passion. I know all the things you need to learn, but I always lead. I struggle too. Gabor Mate talks about how he still is triggered by things that happened right at the start of his life that led him to be this expert that we all look up to and laud. But I think that's crucial. And even if you take one thing away from today, it's vulnerability. And you'll see later poor examples of male role modeling that people still follow. You'll notice most likely there isn't vulnerability as an option. And again, to kind of finally cement that, when I do talks on suicide prevention and mental health, I always lead deliberately with a story of my own struggles. That is for many reasons, but the main one is talking to young people about how it's okay to struggle. So I love Gabor Mate. And this is what I want to talk about. I use the dad vacuum simply because that was my experience of how I came to this kind of thought process, and it will make sense. So I apologize if dad is not the word that you would identify with. This is the study I want to kind of start with. In 1935, the average man had 40 hours a week free. By 1990, this had reduced to 17 hours. That's the kind of official findings. Whereas let's wind that forward to 2025. How long is that now? Really, with the introductions of screens, media. So I just think the crucial thing is there's that free time being reduced. This is not me judging, this is me observing. As I say, a lot of fathers are not there for very good reasons, particularly trying to get their kids into schools, keep them there. That is why both parents, why the whole family, my grandparents, for example, contributed to my education. Well, everyone's working hard, but I just want to kind of highlight that. And then he goes on to say, this is time a father could have been nurturing. So that is a judgment, but I think it's really, really important, really interesting. And a couple of comments on what the young need: stability, presence, attention, advice, good psychic food, which I really like, and unpolluted stories. A lot of them are quite obvious. Psychic food's quite funny. Unpolluted stories is what got me. And again, what we'll see, which is missing, I think, in poor role modeling, is that idea of, here's the truth. Here's how I actually run my business. Here's actually what goes on. And unpolluted meaning, for me at least, being vulnerable, saying these are the mistakes. And one of my mentors, you'll see later, as part of how I'm structuring this, I remember calling him about a particular problem in business or in my personal life, and he'll always be brilliant. He'll kind of stable, he'll be there, he'll pay me attention, give me good advice. And what he'll then do is tell me a story about how he went through something, obviously with, well, not always, but much more severe. And it really helps me because I go, wow, okay, cool. It's okay to struggle. It's okay that he's done really well, but he still went through these difficult things. And I think that is beautiful. So just a summary of how time is being reduced for the average man. And again, dad, the average man, please forgive if that is not how you're kind of experiencing it, or not the young person you look after, or vice versa. But this is just how I'm wording it to get the point across. This is my proposal. This is something I came up with when I was doing some professional development with a wonderful doctor called Penny Utton. And I said, again, in passing, why it's kind of stuck as dad, was my own experience. So I had a hole. There was a lack of, a vacuum of dad. That's how it was for me. So what happened from there, if you can just look at it, I know it's silly and simple, but there is that outline of a father, which is the absence of, within a vacuum. So there's a pressure there. And I normally talk to the young people about, okay, who have you heard of on this list? Stephen Bartlett, some throw their hands up. Chris Williamson, few. Jordan Peterson, not that many. Jocko Willing, barely any. Andrew Huberman. Suddenly people are like, okay, that's interesting. I joke about Batman. In my experience, there's a bust just here, which you can see, but it was so bad for me that I genuinely saw the Batman films and went, that's a great example. I was that devoid of positive male role models, not to speak negatively about my school teachers, they were brilliant, but I think this was just before I managed to go to a great school, much like Forrest with this kind of rich tapestry of people and experiences and outlooks. But Batman for me, which just struck, and it's cool because the kids laugh when I do talks, but I think they understand that it was quite desperate, really, and I was looking for something to fill that. You'll see the top left, which I will talk about just a moment again, but Andrew Tate. That's the one where, if you remember me saying, I asked them to put their hands up when they know someone, and you can kind of see in these rooms, Andrew Tate, it's every single one, hands straight up. So to me, that just demonstrates that, okay, say there is an absence of male presence, say there is a vacuum around outward pressure, something that even feels, looks, sounds like a positive male role model, which I'll talk about why he isn't, not holistically, gets sucked right in. So again, I know this ruffles people, I know this isn't always true, but for me, when I talk about Andrew Tate, it's not a case of, I don't need to convince you. I heard about him, I do a lot of my work because of what has already happened and what is continuing to happen, is that young people are still consuming his content. So not that this is empirically true as to how, but what I'm saying is this is already happening. It's often the kind of parents, carers, teachers that I talk to and say, this is already happening. It's not a case of if this is happening, this is my thoughts as to why. It might be different. But I think things like adolescence, which I'll talk about, and Andrew Tate, just for me point towards my own journey with this. And Andrew Tate is not someone that was in my life, not someone I really know about, thankfully. I'd kind of found my own role models by then. So that's what I'm basing this on. I might pop back to this slide to illustrate points, but what I want to start feeling is this solution side of it. You probably know a lot of this around Andrew Tate, but remember the vacuum, the absence of the father. I'll try and talk about it from my perspective, but you can imagine your young people or something at large for that. Andrew Tate. So really interesting for me because he does display, whether you like it or not, traditionally masculine traits, if you will. And again, is it the absence of fathers? Is it this vacuum? Is it this reduction? I'm not an expert on what's happening with kind of equality, diversity, that world of looking into what it is to be a man. That's not what I'm talking about tonight. What I'm talking about is some of the reasons why young men might be struggling and turning to people like Andrew and his brother Tristan. So they display traditionally masculine traits, that being they have money, success, drive, whether you think they're handsome or not, they're quite, they're not bad looking guys. So they've got that going. He's done well in sport, business. Women is something I always want to talk about because it's just the Achilles heel. Again, it's so problematic with these two. And I think a lot of young men and some of the poor role models I'll talk about later, but he has those traits. So young men with that vacuum. And not to say I wouldn't have been the same myself when I was younger, thankfully. I'm not, but with that vacuum, you see someone like Andrew Tate get sucked right in, and his brother. So these are the issues. So much like Donald Trump, you say 4 things that are true, 2 things that are lies, people consume 6 things. So that's similar to what's happening here. But I also think his attitudes to women, I'll talk about that just a moment. But when you're an adolescent, and for whatever reason, good or bad, you do not have the role models that you're looking for in life, guess what is absolutely always available to you? Your phone, the internet, media, all those kind of things. So this is the issue here. And I talk about some of the solutions being mediation, but just want to kind of highlight why, at least from my perspective, at least with some of the young men I work with, why they say they're like Andrew Tate. Some of the young men that I work with who are in my team or help me with some of the projects, they tell me stories about, well, there was no one around to teach me how to shave. There was no one around to teach me about business. There was no one around to teach me about working out. And I go, okay, you can understand that Andrew Tate is not the best example of that. No, I know that, but that's what came up. That's what stuck. That's what was there because of this vacuum. So I think if it wasn't him, it'd be someone else. Unfortunately, it is him. He's a particularly clever man, and unfortunately for the wrong reasons. But one thing I thought was crucial was I was working with a young man, 18 years old, and he said to me all the reasons why he loved Andrew Tate. And I went, okay, cool. He understood why I kind of just let him talk. Because again, it's not to judge. And I can't tell people how to parent, and I won't. For me, it was listening. He's not my son, so I wasn't getting scared. I wasn't worried. But I went, okay, why him? And one thing that came up that was really, really good from this young man, because we could agree it was not healthy, is there's this aspect of Andrew Tate whereby he says, I have 4 women. That's a very complex issue to explain, but I said, okay, we don't have time because that's so wrong in so many ways. But that's not my nuance. My nuance is, okay, Andrew Tate, every time he has an argument with one woman, doesn't want to deal with it, goes to another one. And I said to him, okay, brilliant. That's how you want to live. If you've got that much money, if you've got that kind of person who's interested in you, then cool. Never deal with your emotional world. Never be in true relation with a woman. Never try to understand the true and healthy dynamics of repair, rupture, interaction, vulnerability. Again, those things are missing if you're jumping around. And there's this wonderful moment, the young man going, yeah, actually, I don't want that. I could never say to a young man, don't make money, don't do well, don't do sport, don't bring yourself to the world. It was really nice for him to say, okay, but actually, I really want to just get on really well with one woman. I was like, awesome. So don't listen to Andrew Tate at all in that sense. So these are the things that you can kind of do with mediation. Social media, I mean, I don't have time to talk about that effect or my thoughts on that, but we can all see the influence of something that is perfect, polluted, because it's not true. It's not something you can interact with. So I'd love to talk more about Andrew Tate, and there's so much. Maybe that's a future one more in depth, but that was just at least my appreciation of one example. Bad idols. Complete transparency, I love Drake, which is the one on the right. Not a huge fan of Future or Central C. I think some of their stuff, you can't say they're not brilliant because they're selling out arenas all over the world and we love them. But for me, I want to illustrate a point of these bad idols. Again, in a similar, hopefully less invasive way as this gentleman, if we take the dad vacuum, absence of, there's a pressure and a need, because I hope we all agree that young people, they need some sense of love, direction, clarity. When you then include kind of rap and hip hop, and I was talking to someone I worked with last night, and she said she had a meeting with a local policeman, and they said, why is it, asking the policeman, why is it you think young people are committing so much crime? Whether you think it's PC or not, because it just isn't. He went, because of rap. He used other words, but he said because of rap and hip hop. And I think it's funny to laugh about that, but a lot of the young people I work with, they are coming in with tracksuits. They have certain attitudes around knife crime, certain attitudes around gangs, being in prison, how they talk about women, how they talk about money. And for me, it's really scary because I've seen the consequences. We all know them. But we have, again, these incredibly prominent entertainers. This is just a selection of 3. There are so many more. What do? Talk about money. How they talk about money. It's not balanced, right? Talk about women. I won't repeat how they talk about women. And it isn't necessarily just single words. It's the general attitude that young people are so absorbent and intelligent and responsive and neuroplastic that it doesn't take much to influence them. Again, they're on their phones listening. Doesn't matter the quality. Unfortunately, this is difficult. Doesn't matter the quality of the parenting or the mentoring or their upbringing or the school to a degree. Of course, it's important, but sometimes if it's in their ears and in front of their eyes, what can you do? You can't be in between that, which is the issue. So issues, attitude to cars, crime, women, money, strength and domination. Use strength inadvertently because it's often violence or it's often not dealing with those kind of things. So as much as I really enjoy some of the music from these people, I think it's important. And I remember working with a client in Spain this summer. We were in the gym and I was listening to my own music, but I popped my ears out and I remember hearing a Central C song and I just got really angry because all I could hear, I won't repeat what was said exactly, but it was just kind of degrading of women, money, cars, being strong and like being the best. And I was listening going like, this is what young people are hearing at 11 years old or 10 years old, because let's face it, with the internet, it's getting younger. How would they not be struggling? Because they don't have a car, and learning how to talk about things, how to say things, because when you listen to music, you watch things, it does affect it. It affects me as an adult. This is part of my job, but I still am affected by things I see. So that was one example. And I just think it's a little bit of a thing to think about. I'll move on. But the last thing I love is KRS-One. So there's Knowledge Rules Supreme, who's one of the forefathers in the 1980s of hip hop, before it became hip hop, rap, all the music we listen to today. And he said beautifully, first of all, hip hop was founded by a woman, which I think is brilliant, because the breakbeat parties they had in the 1980s in New York was due to a woman having organized everything. And then from there, he himself was one of the forefathers, an incredibly insightful and rich and smart man. But he said, all entertainers, rappers of the modern age are boys making music for girls, little girls. That was his thought. So it's not an age qualification. He said there are young men who are 12 years old who are working to keep their family safe, working to keep their family whole. They are men, 12-year-old men, and you've got 40 these rappers in front of us and know exactly their ages, but they're kind of 30-year-old boys. So that point was, it's not your age that defines whether you're a boy or a man. It's your attitude, your demeanor, your presence. So if you've got a lot of people literally with microphones who are broadcasting certain messages all over the world, it really does have an effect, much as Andrew Tate. So that's one that's kind of a little bit less obvious, but more in the limelight, that might be having a negative effect. Adolescence. I think, again, I was putting some of this together and talking it through with someone I work with, and she said, what's your thought on adolescence? And I don't think it was an absolutely brilliant start. And even the people who made it, if you watch just after the episodes are finished, there's a kind of commentary, and they said this is just the first conversation, just the first piece of kind of media they wanted to make. So I think adolescence is absolutely brilliant. And I think some of the things that were blown up in the news, unfortunately, were a little bit irrelevant when it comes to what I think about, which is suicide prevention, masculine mental health. What was really crucial, which is absolutely beautiful, is the importance and the need for mediation. So I'd say that again, forgive me. If someone's on a phone, so for example, in adolescence, the young man was in his room, wasn't he? Who knows, maybe he was listening to rap music, or much worse, this is just quite accessible, there's awful stuff on the internet. Maybe he's watching Andrew Tate, or people that are much worse. I promise you there are much worse people. Let's say, for example, that's what he's doing. Again, what do we need? Not to blame the father, because it was a piece of drama. It was beautiful. But let's say that instead of that young boy being in his room with no mediation between the computer screen and his own identity and choices and actions and pressures, because it is very hard being an adolescent. I always stress that point, because there's elements I remember, but there's so many elements I don't, but I know it's hard. My thought is, what if someone was sat next to him watching it with him? A lot of the work that I do, and a lot of the work that great parents, guardians, brothers, sisters, good people do in community is going, well, that's interesting that he said that. Well, why has he used that word? Sometimes it's, oh, whatever, mum, you don't know. But just that conversation of, okay, well, I see why you enjoy that. I see why you get that. But do you think that's right? And again, going back to that example I had with my client, was going, oh, that's interesting. Why do you think that? What did you learn? What do you like? And then sitting with them and going, is that really what you want? And it's so easy to say, because if we go right back to this, whether you believe it or not, if the time is being reduced for both parents, this is just an example of dads and men, if time is being reduced, maybe you're watching this again like, how, what do you know? You have kids at school. Exactly. That's my point. So that if time is being reduced, there's less time for that presence and mediation and consistency. And I'm not saying that there are solutions, so thank you, Natasha, because I can't solve everything, but it's that idea of what's happening. Start there. Why is it happening? Why do we think it's happening before it's proven? And even Gabor Mate had some incredible things around, for example, in the 80s, how trauma affects your immune system. People laughed. They were like, what are you talking about? Now there's a whole new set of science studies and findings 30 years later. So as Natasha said, well, it's the case of, well, let's start thinking about it now. Let's start drawing conclusions. Even if they're not perfect, they might save a life. They might help a young person. They might improve the culture, vice versa. So that's always what I'm after, filling that vacuum. So if we can accept, just for this evening, for my own kind of presentation of what I think, is that we can accept that there is a kind of a pressure and an absence for some young people, particularly young men, and of course young women as well, then it's a case of, okay, well, how do we fill the vacuum? And that isn't, not everyone can afford services such as kind of male mentoring that I do, but also, I work for a charity, and that's me doing that on a larger scale with lots of kids. So they still get that, but it's filling that vacuum. And a really good point was made yesterday, is how do we move forward? So this is what's happening right now. This is what we're already dealing with. And often I'll be sat at lunch like I was today, and you look around, and even my colleague who's 22, they're also on their phones at lunch. That's fine. I used to get angry about that, but now it's like, well, that's what they're doing. So again, the jury's out as to how we do that. Maybe the social media laws Australia are bringing in might be iterated here, which would be interesting. However, I want to crack on through this. So in terms of solutions, because I really want to think about solutions this evening, is if we say there's a vacuum, and these are the role models that are available. Some of them are brilliant, some of them are films, but none of them are really, none of them are like, you can shake their hand. So, which is crucial. Again, you can't shake their hands that you pay. You can probably pay a lot to shake your hands. And even this is media we've watched. So it's a dramatic interpretation of someone's reality, and you just can't get better than it. It's beautiful, but it's not real. So when I think about mentoring, there are kind of two things I think about. So I love this luck equation. I did a talk when I started doing speaking work. Actually, the first one I did was on what luck is. So Seneca, pre-Bible, so 2,500 years ago, was kind of cited to have written down that luck is when preparation meets opportunity. So I say that because when I went to go and find mentors, bear with me, that was the equation I needed. So if you've got young people, or if you're thinking for yourself, how do I go and create things? That was one aspect that led to my ability to mentor. I had to have mentors first before I could mentor. And then there's this 33%, which I should probably add on here. I should spend 33% of my time with people who are 10 years ahead of me, 33% in my kind of current surroundings, people at the same period of their life, and then 33% mentoring people who are 10 years behind me. And that's kind of how I like to also think about my life. But the best thing that I think applies most and goes against this idea that there's so much media mentoring, media input, phone input, is from the Bhagavad Gita. It says, being is the greatest teacher. And I interpret that as, if I'm in a group with young men as I was today, verbally is often the focus. What do I say to them? How do I discipline them? I really don't rely on that. I think that as much as I always try to say the right things, much of the seminar, I always try to have the right studies, vice versa, but I would say 5% of what I say is what the young men absorb and change. The main thing, as the Bhagavad Gita says, is what am I doing? When I do school talks, they look at how tall I am I in shape, how old I am, do they interpret me to have any money or not? Do I have friends or not? And these are all kind of checks that are happening. And I think it's really an ideal world, but I'll throw it out there. Again, how do we move forward? Have a great mentor, have a presence. And again, the Bhagavad Gita, I love it because I think these young people just watch every single thing that I do all the time. And I might not even know they're watching. So it's trying to embody, which is a lot of pressure. But then I see the changes, I see the betterment of them, and they're probably quite stubborn. I know young boys are quite stubborn, but they appreciate it. They learn. They'll often copy what I'm doing. So that was my kind of thought on mentoring, and this is what it led to. So forgive that's as it is. But this led me, instead of having this absence, which I just flip back there, those are the kind of media influences, whereas I ended up being lucky enough to have built through hard work and seeking them out. That's my point. It's not easy to find these people, but I've got all sorts of mentors. So if I go kind of from 9 a.m. on a clock, you've got previous Fiji rugby captain. And again, I'm really, some things he is one of the best in the world, fitness or certain aspects of mentoring when he comes to work with me. But some things he says, I know enough to be like, that's just not, I don't agree with you. And then you've got Daniele, who pretty much can't fault him, to be completely honest, history professor, martial artist, historian, podcaster, author, fantastic father, wonderful, really, really good man. That's one of the first ones I always call, and I kind of look to. And got Oliver Chittenden as well, just top right there with Boris Johnson. He asked me to use that photo, probably wouldn't have done otherwise. But again, absolutely fantastic. Someone I actually know. So Daniele lives in LA, and Tani is in Stoke, but Ollie lives near next to my parents' village. And I know these people, and there's Roland as well I can get on the phone to, and then there's Hamish, who's a kind of coach of mine, so maybe more of a paid mentor, but has then become a kind of professional friend. And then Pete Kirtley in the bottom left there is similar to sort of someone I can pick up the phone to. So what this means for me now at 30 is that something happens in my life, I'm struggling, I literally can call these people and they all get back to me sometimes within half a day or less. And that is what you have to work so hard for in so many ways. And it's an absolute privilege, but this is my circle of mentors. This is what I accidentally found some through my life. And then I suddenly decided, if I'm going to be better at my job, if I'm going to feel better, if I'm going to feel part of a community, albeit sometimes they are digitally, they are real people with real stories and real vulnerabilities. And again, that's that going back right to Gabor Mate through to what's missing and how do we replace that. So hopefully that's a kind of just aware of time as well, because there's a lot of information going through, but very briefly, I suffer from a lack of male role modelling and accumulated some. Thankfully, I wasn't a kind of victim to Andrew Tate, but I'm sure there were people I was probably close enough to finding out about that didn't. That's the explanation of this. Poor role modelling. And the thing with Andrew Tate is there's a lot of private courses and people in his industry that you wouldn't necessarily know are going on. So crazily, the shame and the media outrage at Andrew Tate has probably forced more people to consume his content and to do it privately. And actually, he started to run a course about how even though he's banned, you can make money creating his content for him and spreading it. So yeah, this is someone that is incredibly smart, but for the wrong reasons. So it's quite scary, but this stuff is happening, and that's why we've got to learn about it, talk about it, push it out there. Otherwise, we're just going to shame people into going and doing it more. So there's lots of models around that. More explicit, and maybe it's a bit more obvious, but it does have an effect. What is our media? What is our music? How are they role models to us? Footballers, a lot of the work I do in football, the conversations about that is how people, and rugby as well, is like which prominent, important rugby players, football players can step up and say, hey, I'm struggling. Hey, this is what it means to me. A lot of them are scared to do that because it goes against the majority of what's going on. Adolescence is crucial. And I think I want to finish with just a few slides. So you can see those there. It's only the kind of 4 we want to go through. But this was really interesting as I watched a really cool, quite short, but really raw documentary on suicide prevention for men. And what it was men just talking to camera about what they feel to be difficult about being male with regards to mental health. And I think just a few things to go through: addiction, isolation, boredom, brotherhood, meaning a lack of, being broke is an issue. You always have to kind of, you've got to have money, you've got to provide, you've got to do these things. And it's not necessarily that black and white, but it was really nice just to see these men talking. Limited masculinity is how I talk about toxic masculinity, because again, if you just shout and scream and throw the baby out with the bathwater, toxic males, they're all the same. Andrew Tate, we're really missing the point. For me, it's a limited experience of being masculine. Because then kids go, well, what do you mean? Because toxic, everyone shuts off. Boys are scared, and this is what happens. If you go limited masculinity, I heard it said, it was really beautiful. Then you go, what you're experiencing is only a part of it. You can be really strong, capable, and dominant, and successful, and sweet, and sensitive, and kind, and protective. And I think if we go back to Daniele, one of my mentors, in one of his books, he talks about the reason why you should study martial arts and become physically hard and intimidating is because then you can protect the sensitivity within yourself and those that you love around you. That's why you go out. So it's really interesting, I think, looking at kind of masculinity. Again, that's something to be looked at. Crying is such a big one. Huge one. Fighting, asking for and receiving help, very difficult, something I find very difficult myself. Again, I love to talk about this stuff because I always have to challenge myself to be able to really go, but can you talk to people about this? Because I still struggle with some of these. But masks and humor, huge one. Anger, hurting others, sexual assault, belonging or not belonging, repression, which is that sweeping under the carpet of really difficult things. That's always my experience when I talk about my difficulties in life, always been from repressing, ignoring, not facing. Post-traumatic stress disorder. Again, most of our armed forces tend to be men, and PTSD is probably more reported in men, not to say it doesn't happen to everyone who goes and suffers that. And it's not just, PTSD is a human response. It's not just in warfare. But feminine core, people really struggle. And I always do my best to explain to schools that, again, I'm a very sensitive person. The feminine part of me is absolutely crucial for my relationships, for my work, for tenderness in life and expression and creativity. So it's saying feminine is not locked to women, masculine is not locked to men. It's what's your personal balance, and just look at them as the kind of left and rights. So I think that's again, that could be a whole new thing. Sensitivity, love, self-acceptance. So just to finish, these are kind of more aspects of what goes on here. Is the third thing I talked about. Again, that's me, you, and the third thing. So if I'm working with young men and kind of more masculine women, it's rugby ball. Why is that? That's the third thing for them to focus on and fixate on. It kind of just gives them, even like, we're out on a big Astro, so if I'm just talking to them, people might be like, oh, I know what he does for a job, but it just gives them a little bit of a shielding. And even in this room, my business partners, it was kind of 2-hour conversation of him really going through things, which is chucking the ball back and forth. So certainly art, walking, climbing, all of the above can be really good examples of that. Socialization, we can't talk about all these because there are so many, but I will finish on some barriers and beliefs for men, because I always think these are really crucial, really important. Get any questions, please fire them through. But if I have been stood up for a date, if I have failed a project at work, if I have not been able to secure something, or someone has made me feel a certain way, I remember having any of these flashpoint moments and just going, look, I've got to talk to young people about mental health, masculine mental health, men's mental health, but I can't ask for help. So instead of, I probably did spin my mind, but I went, I'm going to write down all the reasons why, all the things, if they're a thought, a feeling, a whisper from ages ago, why do I feel like I can't be vulnerable and express? So I went to a military private school, very good one, but you're kind of socialized, even from my grandparents' generation who were in the war, you're socialized to get on with it. Again, I'm not judging these things. These are things that came to my head. Socialized to do it on your own. This testosterone paradox, if the harder something is, the more of a payoff there is, to keep it really simple. But unfortunately, that can lead to having to feel like you have to do everything on your own. Also, the kind of lonely chapter of being a male online is that, men should have a time when they struggle on their own. Isn't it heroic and brilliant? Yeah, but 10% of the time, not 90. So there's always that issue. And again, I think testosterone is incredibly useful if you can understand how to circulate that. And it's obviously vital for everyone's functioning, but particularly kind of young men, and learning that. Courage to show no vulnerability, unfortunately, very true. Embarrassed, I felt very embarrassed. Nice guy syndrome refers to repression, so people that don't ever want to be seen as not being perfect and nice. Sadly, that means they don't process or express any negativity. That kind of gets bottled away and it snaps. So this is where you get awful things happening because people are always trying to be nice and being perfect and hiding. So shame for not being able to handle it, condition to defend ourselves against pain and vulnerability. That was from a study, really, really good one. And lower value and self-esteem should I be struggling. And just to finish, some solutions as I see them, particularly for young men, and starting really early, even if these things seem kind of odd to them, just don't, this can save your life one day, essentially. And saying, if you have shame, you share it. Remember, my therapist said that, and there's really, really bad ways to just share your shame, and there are really, really good, helpful, important, structured ways. So I can't go into all that, but essentially, if you're feeling shame around something, if you share it, it will half. I don't know if it's exactly half, but I've definitely experienced it to be very difficult and very much worth it. So, and then that follows to the pain and growth paradigm, or strength through vulnerability. We say lifting weights. When I talk to young men, you break down your muscle with a heavy weight, which is difficult. And what happens if you recover properly? You're stronger. Pain and growth, strength through vulnerability. And again, trying to give them those wordings. Question the socialization. That's pretty much what we've been talking about today. And also looking at what kind of culture young people grew up with. 10 pillars of well-being. Don't have time for that today, but that's a huge one. Primal Grace is the philosophy we talked about. I'm a highly sensitive man. Great book that's developed from highly sensitive people, which is Elaine Aron's work, which I think was the 80s or 90s. Brilliant psychologist. But just understanding that I think it might be 20% of the population are highly sensitive in terms of sensory and processing kind of thing. So understanding all that helps me to kind of go, all right, fine. have a superpower, but it can be a real kryptonite at times as well. This is reaching out to trusted friends, similar to shame and share it. It's kind of like, think it first, then journal it, then maybe test it, then say it's someone you really trust, all the way through to professional and the public. And I follow that too before I talk about something on stage or in a seminar. I make sure I've gone through the healthy processing of all of it. So that's crucial. Anger is a secondary emotion. I just love that because, yes, I can get fixed in the anger or the crying, but which you should express, but then going, where's that come from? It's not simply a thing. So that is where I will conclude it. So a lot of information there. Again, pause, playback, or any questions, absolutely fine. But I love doing these, really enjoying Forest School. And I think Forest School for me are cutting edge in terms of all the schools I visited. There's a couple of competing for that for sure, but I'm always blown away, always appreciative. Of course, I would say that because they're good people, but I've seen it. These things are crucial. They're affecting young people, and I really hope that something from tonight was useful. So I'll end it there, and thank you very much.